Story 3. The Linguist's Finding. Throughout her career, Professor Maria Santos documented the last speakers of languages that would be extinct after their elderly custodians died. She had spent endless hours with tribal elders who held entire civilizations in their memories, preserved the last songs of the Jedek in Malaysia, and recorded the last words of the Taushiro in Peru. The letter that reached Oxford University in the winter of 2023, however, described a different language, one that was alive but unheard. Father Miguel Hernandez, a priest who works with indigenous communities in Guatemala's mountains, sent the letter. His description of a village that only speaks in silence was written in a shaky, urgent style that seemed to be the result of an overworked mind. He did, however, provide linguistic samples that were unquestionably authentic, symbols that suggested complex grammatical structures, but bore no resemblance to any known writing system. These markings, according to the letter, are the only traces of a spoken language that was stolen by ancient spirits many generations ago. Father Hernandez's story was rejected by Maria's co-workers as folklore tinged with desperation. Anthropologists saw cultural adaptation, while missionaries frequently saw miracles. She was intrigued by the symbols, though. With mathematical accuracy, they demonstrated traits of both syllabic and logographic writing systems, indicating a highly developed linguistic tradition. 3 months later, her recording equipment was packed with conventional linguistic documentation tools when she arrived in Guatemala. It took 2 days of hiking through mountainous terrain that seemed to exist outside of time to get to Father Hernandez's mission. She was met by a gaunt, hollow-eyed priest who spoke Spanish quickly and feverishly while recounting what he had seen in the village he named San Silencio. As they ascended farther into the mountains, he informed her that they remembered sound. The elderly recall a time when speech was possible here. However, that was prior to the agreement and the law requiring silence. Father Hernandez guided her to a ridge with a view of a valley covered in a persistent fog. Maria had never seen a village like the one below in her travels. The buildings were old but well kept, and when viewed from above, their precise geometric arrangements created larger symbols. People who moved with synchronized precision tended gardens that flourished in unimaginable abundance. Maria's professional training, however, screamed warnings because of the silence. As a linguist, she recognized that acoustic signatures were a natural byproduct of people living and working together in human settlements. There was no such signature in San Silencio. Even the background sounds of the wind and water seemed to be absorbed by the utter silence that pervaded the village. The villagers were introduced to the priest solely by gesture. The community's reaction was swift and intricate, a highly developed sign language that included body language, facial expressions, and spatial relationships that Maria had never seen before. She did, however, pick up on something else beneath their communication, the spoken language's rhythmic patterns, which were reflected in their expression and movement. With ceremonial gravity, the village elder, a woman whose age was unclear, came toward Maria. She had a bundle of bark sheets with the same symbols Father Hernandez had written on them. But when Maria saw them in their proper context, she understood that they were more than just writing. They were a single integrated system that included historical records, linguistic maps, and musical notation. Maria followed the elder whom the others addressed with a particular gesture that she took to be a name sign to the main building in the village. With its walls covered in symbols documenting the history of the community, the building was unquestionably the oldest in the settlement. As Maria began to comprehend the tragic tale, the inscriptions told she spent hours photographing and recording them. The wall carvings indicate that San Silencio was once a flourishing community with a highly complex spoken language. their oral traditions epic poems that lasted for days, songs that were said to affect weather patterns and ritual chants that allowed them to communicate with nature spirits, had made the villages famous throughout the region. However, entities the carvings portrayed as tall, angular figures with an excessive number of limbs had taken notice of their voices. According to the suggested symbols, these entities lived in the pauses between sounds, gaining strength with each word uttered and consuming vocal vibrations for sustenance. The entities grew stronger the more the villagers sang, talked, and rejoiced. The crisis occurred during a festival honoring the village's establishment. The entities appeared in the physical world as hundreds of voices joined in traditional songs. The carvings depicted individuals collapsing as their voices were literally yanked out of their throats, turning into visible streams of light that the entities devoured with blatant hunger. Their head shaman, who was symbolized by great wisdom and sacrifice, was the village's savior. The shaman had persuaded the entities to leave through some ceremony or agreement that was not made explicit in the carvings. However, the cost was eternal silence. The villagers were forbidden from speaking out loud again for fear of calling the creatures back. From a linguistic standpoint, Maria found the community's adaptation to be fascinating. They had created their visual language as a translation of speech, not as a substitute for it. Every gesture, symbol, and arrangement of space matched particular acoustic patterns found in their native tongue. They had condensed their language into silence, but they had not lost it. Through meticulous visual communication with the elder, Maria gained insight into the extent of their linguistic preservation. In addition to being historical documents, the bark documents served as acoustic maps that demonstrated how the intonation, rhythm, and emotional content of spoken language could be represented visually. Maria learned how to read the landscape from the elder. The layout of the village wasn't random. The placement of the walkways, gardens, and buildings produced visual rhythms that mirrored the spoken language that had been lost. Villagers were actually walking through conversations as they went about their daily lives, forming the spatial equivalent of sentence structures with their footsteps. Maria saw something on her third day in San Silencio that permanently altered the way she thought about human communication. The village came together for what she understood to be a naming ceremony after a child was born the previous evening. However, the community as a whole engaged in hours of coordinated movement in place of spoken words. A three-dimensional representation of the child's name in the original language was created by the positions and gestures of each villager, each of whom played a distinct role in the ceremony. Maria marveled at the way meaning moved through time and space, as intricate as any spoken poetry, but conveyed only through well-coordinated silence. Observing Maria's interest, the elder led her to a private room in the main structure. The symbols that covered the room were unlike any Maria had ever seen. They were not practical communications or historical documents, but something much more intricate. Using exact combinations of gesture expression and spatial placement, these phonetic maps demonstrated how each sound in the original language could be replicated. Maria became increasingly excited as she recognized that she was witnessing the most comprehensive linguistic preservation system ever developed. The villagers had not only preserved their language in writing, but they had also devised a way to use visual representation to preserve every subtlety of intonation, pronunciation, and emotional content. However, her enthusiasm was dampened by her increasing awareness of the price. The elder showed her one last set of symbols, which were highlighted with mineral pigments that gave them a glowing appearance in the low light and were carved more deeply than the others. The watchers, the things that continued to lurk in the pauses between sounds, waiting for any reason to reappear, were described by these symbols. The carvings depicted the fate of those who even unintentionally broke the silence. The entities would follow the acoustic trail back to anyone who had similar language patterns, rather than simply taking the speaker. If one person used the forbidden words out loud, it could consume entire communities, families, and friends. Maria spent 2 weeks learning how to use the village's visual language system in order to document San Silencio. She found layers of meaning that would take years to fully understand, emotional expressions that could only be accurately expressed through spatial relationships, cultural concepts that had no equivalent in any spoken language. However, she also found something sinister. The elder took her to a restricted area on the outskirts of the settlement on her last night there. Here, older buildings that were centuries older than the present village were partially obscured by meticulously tended vegetation. The symbols adorning these ruins chilled Maria's blood. They served as warnings in addition to being linguistic records. This was not the only place where the voices of San Silencio had been taken. The symbols alluded to a universal phenomenon, ancient creatures that existed everywhere. Human language grew too sophisticated, elegant, or potent. The elder's parting message was both a blessing and a burden. She pressed a small stone tablet into Maria's hands, its surface covered in symbols that contained everything: the complete phonetic guide to the village's original language, the grammatical structures that allowed meaning to flow through silence, and most importantly, the specific acoustic patterns that would summon the watchers. The message was unambiguous. Maria could tell the world about her linguistic discovery, but she must never try to speak the language out loud. Not only would doing so put her in danger, but it would also set off a beacon that would guide the entities to any community with similar linguistic patterns. Maria came back to Oxford with the most dangerous information she had ever had and the most important linguistic discovery of the century. She carefully avoided mentioning the original spoken language or the entities that had silenced it in her published papers on San Silencio, instead concentrating on the visual communication system. However, Maria would study the stone tablet and work on her covert project, a full reconstruction of the village's original language, late at night in the safety of her locked office. Not to speak it, never to speak it, but to understand how language itself could become so powerful that it attracted the attention of things that lived in the spaces between words. 5 years later, she was discovered at her desk surrounded by papers with symbols on them that nobody at the university could decipher. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, but her colleagues noted something strange. Her mouth was open, as if she had been speaking when she died, but the office's acoustic monitoring system showed no sound had been made. The stone tablet from San Silencio was never found among her effects, though security cameras showed no one entering or leaving her office during the time of her death. But sometimes, when the building is quiet and empty, maintenance staff report hearing something like whispered conversations coming from Maria's old office. The conversations are always too quiet to make out, always just beyond the threshold of understanding. But linguistic students who work late in the building have noticed something disturbing. The whispers seem to be teaching them things, showing them connections between words and meanings that their professors never mentioned. And sometimes, when they listen very carefully, they realize that the whispers aren't coming from the office at all. They're coming from inside their own heads, speaking in a language that feels ancient and familiar, teaching them words that they desperately want to say aloud. Story 4. The Sound Therapist's Descent. Dr. Rebecca Walsh had built her career on the healing power of sound. Her acoustic therapy practice in Portland had helped trauma survivors find their voices, again assisted autistic children in developing communication skills, and guided meditation practitioners into deeper states of consciousness through carefully crafted soundscapes. She believed with the fervor of a true convert that sound was the universe's fundamental healing force. The referral that changed everything came through Dr. James Morton, a psychiatrist colleague who specialized in extreme cases of selective mutism. He had been treating a patient, a young woman found wandering a highway in West Virginia, who hadn't spoken a word since her rescue 3 months earlier. Traditional therapy had failed, pharmaceutical interventions showed no effect, and the patient's condition was deteriorating rapidly. She responds to sound in ways I've never seen Dr. Morton explain during their consultation. Play a recording of traffic noise, and she curls into a fetal position. But certain frequencies, very specific tones, cause her to display signs of recognition, even emotional response. I think whatever traumatized her into silence might actually be acoustic in nature. The patient identified only as Jane, since she couldn't or wouldn't provide her real name, was unlike anyone Rebecca had encountered in 15 years of practice. She was approximately 25 years old, undernourished, but otherwise physically healthy, with an intensity in her eyes that suggested desperate intelligence trapped behind walls of imposed silence. Jane's reaction to Rebecca's initial assessment was immediate and terrifying. The moment Rebecca played her standard calibration tone, a simple 440 Hz sine wave, Jane began writing frantically on the notepad provided for communication. Her handwriting was shaky but urgent. Not safe. They hear. They come. Rebecca lowered the volume, thinking Jane was simply hypersensitive to loud sounds. But even at barely audible levels, Jane's distress intensified. She pointed to her ears, then to the windows, then made cutting gestures across her throat. The message was clear. Making any sound, even therapeutic tones, was dangerous. Intrigued rather than deterred, Rebecca modified her approach. Instead of generating sounds, she began showing Jane visual representations of frequencies, oscilloscope patterns, spectrograms, and harmonic analysis charts. Jane's response was extraordinary. She could identify specific frequencies with perfect accuracy just by looking at their visual patterns, and more remarkably, she could draw complex acoustic landscapes that showed sophisticated understanding of sound behavior. Working through visual communication, Jane began to tell her story. Not the traumatic event that had stolen her voice, but something far more complex, a description of acoustic ecology that challenged everything Rebecca thought she knew about sound and its effects on human consciousness. Through careful questioning and Jane's increasingly detailed drawings, Rebecca learned about a place Jane called the Quiet Valley. According to her illustrations, it was a location where sound behaved according to different rules, where certain frequencies could literally pull consciousness out of the human body, and where silence itself had become a living entity. Jane's drawings showed a community that had learned to communicate entirely without vocalization, using combinations of gesture, spatial positioning, and most intriguingly, to Rebecca-controlled manipulation of ambient acoustic environments. They hadn't eliminated sound entirely, but had learned to work within specific frequency ranges that didn't attract the attention of what Jane's drawings depicted as the listeners. The more Rebecca studied Jane's acoustic maps, the more she began to understand that trauma wasn't what had stolen this woman's voice. Jane had voluntarily silenced herself to protect not just her own survival, but the survival of everyone around her. She carried knowledge of frequencies that could summon entities that existed in the spaces between audible sounds. Rebecca's scientific skepticism warred with growing evidence that Jane's condition involved phenomena beyond conventional psychology. The detailed acoustic knowledge Jane displayed couldn't have been acquired through normal educational channels. Her understanding of frequency interaction, harmonic resonance, and psychoacoustic effects surpassed that of most professional audio engineers. Against her better judgment, Rebecca began to research the geographical coordinates Jane had provided for the Quiet Valley. Satellite imagery showed nothing unusual dense forest in a remote area of West Virginia, far from any major settlements. But when Rebecca analyzed acoustic monitoring data from nearby weather stations, she found anomalies that defied explanation. The area Jane had identified showed sound propagation patterns that violated basic principles of physics. Audio frequencies seemed to bend and twist through the atmosphere in ways that suggested the presence of some unknown acoustic medium. Even more disturbing, the patterns seemed to pulse with organic rhythm, as if the landscape itself was breathing. Rebecca's investigation took an obsessive turn. She began spending nights in her clinic surrounded by acoustic analysis equipment, trying to map the frequency ranges Jane had identified as dangerous. Her own therapeutic sound libraries accumulated over years of practice suddenly seemed threatening when viewed through Jane's acoustic lens. The breakthrough came when Rebecca discovered that Jane's safe frequencies weren't random. They formed a complex harmonic series based on mathematical relationships that appeared in both ancient musical traditions and modern quantum physics. The Quiet Valley's inhabitants hadn't just learned to avoid certain sounds. They had developed an entire acoustic language based on frequencies that existed in the gaps between conventional harmonic structures. Driven by scientific curiosity and growing concern for Jane's deteriorating condition, Rebecca made a decision that would haunt her forever. She constructed a specialized acoustic chamber in her clinic's basement, designed to generate and contain the exact frequency combinations Jane had identified as summoning calls. Her plan was to create a controlled environment where she could study these phenomena without endangering anyone. The first test session seemed successful. Using Jane's acoustic maps as guides, Rebecca generated a low-amplitude version of what Jane called a listener tone, a complex waveform that incorporated multiple frequencies in carefully timed intervals. Her monitoring equipment registered no unusual activity, but Jane, observing through the chamber's observation window, began displaying signs of extreme terror. Jane's warnings became increasingly frantic. She drew pictures showing Rebecca that the acoustic chamber wasn't containing the dangerous frequencies, it was amplifying them, broadcasting them beyond the building across the city and into spaces where things that lived in acoustic shadows could detect and follow them. Rebecca shut down the experiment immediately, but Jane's terror didn't subside. Through increasingly desperate drawings, she tried to explain that Rebecca had already done irreversible damage. The listener tone, even at low amplitude and brief duration, had created what Jane depicted as an acoustic scar, a permanent distortion in the sound environment that would draw unwanted attention. That night, Rebecca's dreams were filled with sounds that existed just beyond the threshold of hearing. She woke repeatedly convinced that something was moving through her house, but her ears could detect nothing unusual. Her professional sound monitoring equipment, however, registered activity in frequency ranges that shouldn't exist in a residential environment. Jane disappeared from the psychiatric facility the following evening. Security cameras showed her walking calmly out of the building, but audio analysis of the footage revealed something impossible. Her footsteps made no sound, as if she was moving through space without disturbing the acoustic environment. Rebecca found her 3 days later in the acoustic chamber, sitting in perfect stillness with her eyes closed and her hands pressed against her ears. Jane's lips were moving soundlessly, as if she was speaking in a language that required no air, no vibration, no acoustic signature. When Jane opened her eyes and saw Rebecca, her expression contained depths of sadness that seemed to encompass the loss of entire civilizations. She wrote one final message. They followed the sound. Now they know where we are. I'm sorry, the acoustic monitoring equipment in Rebecca's clinic began registering activity that defied every principle of sound physics she'd studied. Frequencies appeared and disappeared in patterns that suggested intelligence communication and growing proximity. The sounds were beyond human hearing, but they created harmonics that Rebecca could feel in her bones. Jane's final act was one of desperate sacrifice. She moved to the acoustic chamber's control panel and activated every sound generator simultaneously, creating a cacophony of overlapping frequencies that overloaded Rebecca's monitoring equipment. But instead of summoning the entities Jane feared, the acoustic chaos seemed to confuse them, creating interference patterns that obscured the beacon Rebecca had accidentally created. The sound killed Jane instantly, cardiac arrest induced by acoustic overload. But her sacrifice bought Rebecca time. The chaotic frequencies gradually faded, leaving the clinic in a silence so profound that Rebecca could hear her own blood circulation. Rebecca sealed the acoustic chamber and destroyed all her research on dangerous frequencies. She closed her practice and moved to a remote cabin in Montana, as far from populated areas as possible. But she couldn't escape the knowledge Jane had shared with her, or the growing understanding that the acoustic world was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. In her isolation, Rebecca began to hear them, the listeners that Jane had tried to protect her from. They moved through frequencies just beyond human perception, communicating in languages made of structured silence and negative space. They were searching for the source of the beacon, following acoustic trails that led back to anyone who had ever heard the forbidden frequencies. Rebecca's final recordings, discovered after her death from apparent suicide, contained only ambient room tone. But when analyzed using Jane's acoustic mapping techniques, the seemingly empty audio files revealed layer upon layer of non-human communication. The entities spoke of patience, of tracking prey across vast acoustic distances, and of gratitude toward the human who had shown them how to hide their voices in the spaces between sounds. They spoke of a woman who had sacrificed herself to protect her people's ancient silence, and of another woman who had learned too much about the acoustic spaces where monsters lived. And they spoke of growing hunger, of approaching convergence, and of the day when human civilization would finally generate enough acoustic activity to provide them with a permanent bridge into the world of sound and flesh. Rebecca's clinic stood empty for months after her death, but neighbors reported strange phenomena. The building seemed to absorb sound. Conversations held nearby became muffled, and indistinct car engines quieted as they passed. Even airplane noise seemed to fade when aircraft flew overhead. When the building was finally demolished, workers found the sealed acoustic chamber in the basement. Inside, they discovered Jane's body, perfectly preserved, sitting in the same position Rebecca had found her. But strangest of all, acoustic analysis of the demolition revealed that the chamber had been completely silent since Jane's death. Not just quiet, but acoustically absent, as if the space had been removed from the world of sound entirely. The demolition crew reported that destroying the chamber felt wrong, like breaking something sacred. As the walls came down, they could swear they heard voices, not screaming or protesting, but whispering gratitude for finally being allowed to rest. But in the frequency analysis of the demolition audio, other voices could be detected, inhuman sounds speaking in the acoustic shadows Jane had spent her life trying to avoid. They spoke of doors opening, of barriers falling, and of appreciation for the human who had spent her final years teaching them how to hide their hunting calls in the spaces between conventional sounds.